I would like to start with a few questions about Greece and the relationship between Greece and the creditors under Syriza II. First of all, there are two things that seem a little puzzling to me, and I hope you can enlighten us. The first one is this. In the wake of what could be called the surrender after the referendum, the IMF in particular came out and said that now that Greece had surrendered to the terms of the memorandum, we have to admit that the debt is in fact unpayable, and that some efforts need to be made in order to give some kind of a debt relief to Greece. Immediately, both on the German government and the German central bank and other parts of the creditors said, no way. But there was this tension between these sort of two wings of the creditors' institution, and yet, of recent, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems that the Tsipras government under Syriza II, one of their main push, even though they don't seem to be successful, is to get rid of the IMF, the only institution that seemed to be pushing towards a modicum of debt relief. So my first question is, how do you interpret their moving decision?
Well, firstly, Michel, let's begin by stating the fact, the historical fact, that there is no new development here. The IMF has been repeating, quite correctly, that the Greek debt is unsustainable since 2011-2012. There was even a time when Christine Lagarde in 2012-2013 proposed to the Greek government of the time, the right-wing government, the right-wing PASOK government, to forge an alliance between Athens and Washington DC, IMF, in the Eurogroup in order to bring about debt relief. The then Greek government rejected that, choosing instead to remain loyal, in inverted commas, to Berlin. So what you just described is a repetition, a continuation of this pattern. The explanation for this by Alexis Tsipras, the Greek Prime Minister, I'm sure if he was asked, if you were to put this question to you, why are you interested in getting rid of the only member of the Troika that is supportive of your main priority, which is debt relief, he would answer to you with some cause and some rationality that the IMF keeps making these noises about the importance of debt relief, but it only refers to the part of the debt owed to the Europeans. It will never consider debt relief regarding the part of the debt that is owed to the IMF. So it's only putting forward the suggestion of a haircut of other people's money, not of its own debt, its own loans to Greece. And in addition, and far more importantly, the IMF sets rather ruthless and horrific conditions for this debt relief in the realm of labor relations and pension cuts. So Alexis Tsipras has always had this view, even when I was in the cabinet. It wasn't my view, it was his. I was ambivalent about this, that we are better off getting rid of the IMF, taking the IMF out of the picture because its noises regarding debt relief are insubstantial and hypocritical, and they're not helping much anyway, and then try to deal with the Europeans directly to achieve a better balance between social policies regarding labor markets and pensions in particular and debt relief. I am of the view that this is a mistake because the IMF is instrumental to Berlin, to the federal government, within the context of federal politics in Berlin. And this seeming contest of faculties between Washington DC, Frankfurt, Brussels and Berlin is a kind of game which we shouldn't be playing in Athens. The IMF will stay in the program, possibly without lending more money, because it is absolutely essential for Angela Merkel to be seen in the federal government in Berlin, to have the IMF on her side. The surrender, as you put it, was devastating for one reason. We did not use, by we I mean the Greek government, we did not use the IMF's internal divisions in order to exact from the Troika an agreement where debt relief, debt restructuring, should come first before everything else. Once that surrender was effected, I think all this gaming regarding whether the IMF should be part of the program or not is neither here nor there. It's besides the point. The battle has been lost.
Okay. So that was clarifying on that. My first puzzlement. The second one regards this time the nexus between the memorandum and its consequences on the one hand, and the evolution in the refugee and immigration policy. Starting on August 30th and in the weeks that followed, there was this remarkable change, and you wrote about it among other people, in German policy vis-a-vis refugees. I mean, even though they had already been more welcoming than most other country in the EU before, it became some kind of a new policy, with a famous discourse by Angela Merkel on August 30th about the fact that, first of all, it was our duty to welcome refugees, and second, we can also afford it. And the two were amazing, and the two were radical changes, right? Because the basis of the immigration policy in Europe is the fact that we can't afford it. Okay, so since there was, of course, a shock in this sort of turnabout, after this turnabout of Merkel, and that the French government, the British government, even most people in her own party and government in Germany were very much against it, not even talking about the Eastern European countries. Even though she resisted, nonetheless, she tried to find some kind of a middle ground, which was yes to good refugees, but then no to economic migrants, because we cannot welcome everybody, which all the implication that it had. And so there was an element of creating hotspots and other things in order to make sure that there would be a sorting out of the good and the bad. And in that respect, coming back to Greece, all of a sudden Greece became extremely important, in the sense that, of course, there are a lot of people, a lot of migrants, a lot of refugees in Greece. And since, while Germany was going to be still welcoming, they wanted to limit the inflow as much as possible, there was a lot of pressure that was put on Greece in order to keep the refugees that would arrive in Greece in Greek territory. Which is interesting, because at the same time, they were developing also a policy with Turkey, asking Turkey to keep refugees there. So it's as if Greece was becoming what is called a transit country, like Turkey, like Morocco, like Libya used to be under Gaddafi, there to sort of do the dirty work for the European Union vis-a-vis immigration. But Greece was going to have that same position, but being inside the European Union. And there were talks in the German press in October and November about the fact that the Germans, and at least the German government, Angela Merkel in particular, was ready to consider some kind of, if not debt relief, some kind of gesture towards Greece if Greece accepted to take more refugees or to keep them in Greece. But at the same time, and that's what I don't understand, there were rumors, and more than rumors, there was a pressure coming from the European Commission, for instance, to exclude Greece from Schengen, from the Schengen zone and territory and the privileges of Schengen, because supposedly they were not doing their part in terms of not letting refugee in, or keeping them in, or letting them out. So how do we understand this sort of seem to be double movement? On the one hand, Greece now becomes useful as some kind of a transit country, but at the same time, a really shocking pressure is put on Greece in terms of threatening it to leave Schengen.
if you take three words and put them together, the three words being European, the second one being refugee, and the third word being policy, and you put them together, you end up with a joke. There's no such thing as European refugee policy, in the same way that you would end up with a magnificent anecdote if you put the words European foreign policy together. And what you just described is proof of that. There is no such thing. The policy, on the one hand, and the instruments for implementing it, like Frontex, the body which is supposedly overseeing the protection of the common EU borders, they're in shambles, both in terms of policies and in terms of instruments. Once the flood of refugees began, quite independently of the Greek negotiations regarding the Memorandum of Understanding and so on and so forth, the fact that it coincided with the defeat of our government and the humiliation of the Prime Minister and of all of my comrades who stayed in the government having accepted the surrender. At the time I said that it was a defeat for the Athens government, but it was a major wounding injury of the spirit of Europe. The notion that you can drag through the mud and you can humiliate by forcing upon a bankrupt country's government a program that everybody knows is going to fail. Another huge loan on conditions that are absolutely impossible to fathom. Like, for instance, let me just give you a very simple example. The idea that all Greek companies, whether they are a one-person company or a conglomerate or a corporation, will have to prepay in the last 2 months of 2015 the whole of 2016 corporate tax. You only need to state it in order to recognize that this is what you do to a country if you want to crash it, and you humiliate the government that accepts this kind of rule, right? The moment you impose such a humiliating treaty on one state in order to bring about an electoral outcome that you prefer, you being the Troika, in Spain, in Portugal, in Ireland, you realize that the very spirit of the European Union has been crushed, has been broken, has shattered. Once it is shattered, how can you expect a common, humane, rational, enlightened approach to the problem of refugees? Once the spirit of the Union has been dealt such a heavy blow, then everybody thinks about their strategy for avoiding their contribution to the common cause. And everybody adopts a NIMBY attitude, a not in my backyard attitude. And everybody's trying to shed their responsibility regarding refugees, regarding any burden sharing. Angela Merkel at that point responded magnificently. I don't know why, but I don't really care. I would not be surprised if the terrible effect on Germany's image of the way that the Greek government, our government, was dealt with in July had something to do with it. Because Angela Merkel can be accused of many things, but not of not being an astute politician who understands the effect of various developments on Germany's image and her own image as a chancellor. But again, I'm pleased that she made this magnificent decision, whatever the underlying purpose and rationale was. Of course, once the Greek government was humiliated and the spirit of the Union was crushed, that magnificent decision was not supported by a fragmenting European Union. So she found herself in the eye of a storm. She found herself receiving the slings and arrows of a lot of ultra-nationalist, anti-refugee, blatantly racist, or sometimes quasi-racist, hidden racist narrative against her and her decision to open the borders to the Syrian refugees. And then she had to backtrack and to try to create some kind of fudge, typical European Union fudge. Part of that fudge is what you described, thinking in terms of borders and buffer zones. So the idea of reconstituting borders within Europe, aided and abetted by the terrible events here in Paris, of creating a wall between the European Union and Turkey, with a buffer zone on the other side of the wall that would be purchased from President Erdogan of Turkey for 2.5 billion euros, while having another buffer zone within Greece, with Frontex, or an evolution of Frontex, playing the role of effectively taking over the control of the Greek border with Turkey from the Greek authorities. And when the Greek authorities resisted that, on the basis that we don't really have a federation and we don't have a federal border patrol, like we do in the United States and elsewhere, then suddenly the Greek government was again treated in the same way we were treated a few months before, when it came to debt relief, to economic reforms, social reforms, with threats. So the way we were threatened with Brexit, again the Tsipras government was threatened with exit from Schengen. This is what happens when an economic crisis that was inevitable given the bad design of the common currency area that we created spills over into a crisis of politics, of culture, of the constitution of Europe, of legitimacy, and a crisis of European democracy in the final analysis.
That is an intent. Now the question is, de facto, what could it mean? The fact that Germany in particular will be, and meaning the German government in particular, will be under pressure more and more to do something, whether it sticks to the line of Angela Merkel so far of generosity, which is becoming relative generosity, or whether she surrenders to the pressure of her own party, the CSU and others, and in fact takes a tougher line, which seems to be happening now in the wake of what happened in Cologne on New Year's Eve and in other cities. But then will not that necessarily sort of change in a strange way the relationship between Germany at least, or the EU and Greece, in the sense that Greece will all of a sudden be needed, as you say, as this sort of inner buffer zone?
I don't believe in that. I don't believe that the bargaining power of the current Greek government has been increased by these developments, and that is because you can only increase something if it's non-zero. If it's zero, if you multiply zero by any number, you get zero. So Greece's bargaining power is zero now. You multiply it by any factor you choose, you end up with zero.
Okay.
And it is zero because of the surrender. Remember, the MOU, which I refused to sign and vote for in August, in its first page has one sentence, the killer sentence, as I call it. It states, I think verbatim, that the Greek authorities commit to agreeing with institutions. Full stop. Even if they don't agree, is the implication. So any treaty between me and you, where I agree to agree with you, or I can commit to agree with you, whereas you don't commit to agree with me, this is effectively a surrender of my inalienable rights and the transformation of my person into your slave. Once you've done that, then you don't have bargaining power. Greece was always important. It was important before July and August. If you take just one quick look at the map of Europe, of Russia, of Ukraine, of Turkey, in relation to North Africa, Libya, and so on, you realize that which the Americans always understood, at least since 1946, when they intervened in the Greek Civil War, the geographical position of Greece renders the place a strategic key point. That was always the case. Last year, when I was a minister, it was clear that the United States, Berlin, Brussels, considered us to be crucial in developments, especially vis-à-vis Russia, Ukraine, ISIS, Libya, Egypt, the Palestinian issue. And they only put a squeeze on us with the closure of banks and the threat of Brexit and so on, when they knew that our side was about to capitulate. So once they know you capitulate, it doesn't really matter how important you are to them, because they know they have you. And therefore, I don't believe that the added bargaining power of the refugee, caused by the refugee issue, is going to make any difference once they take it for granted that effectively they rule the roost in Greece.
Okay. So now moving from Greece to the possible evolution of that grim situation that you just described, not only for Greece but for the rest of Europe, it seems that the change can come from within, internally, with political movements, and we'll get to that. But there's another element, an external element, which is the apparent crisis of the Chinese economy, with all its ripple effect. So while commercially, at this point, the commercial relation between China and the EU, maybe with the exception of Germany, is not so big that that is a threat to the continuation of the policy of the EU, nonetheless, or the Eurozone in particular, nonetheless, in short or medium range, this could change in the sense that imports in China are probably going to be reduced, not only because of the lesser growth, but also to their reaction to the lesser growth, which will be to reboost an export economy rather than one that was more geared towards the growth of the domestic market. And after all, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to me that one of the key elements that decided, especially the German government, that they no longer needed Southern Europe as consumers, was the fact that they had shifted their main markets from Europe to China and the other emerging countries. So if that changes, does that possibly constitute a threat to the continuing ordoliberal, austerity-driven policies that Germany has and that it managed to impose on Europe?
I wonder. In 2013, I was re-editing a book that I had scripted in 2011 called The Global Minotaur, which was my theory of the global crisis in 2008 and its aftermath. And I wrote exactly the story that you just put to me. I wrote it up in the last chapter. Effectively, what I had said in the original book in 2011 was that immediately in the aftermath of the great financial sector implosion that began with Bear Stearns and Northern Rock and Lehman Brothers in 2007, 2008, the Chinese authorities, very astute, understood what was going on, and they, in a state of panic, decided that it was imperative to them to maintain growth rates in China at a level which was necessary to keep the social economy stable, to maintain the migration waves within China from the hinterland to the coastal areas, hoping that by doing so on the basis of building bubbles through real estate operations that would finance through asset price inflation credit to the economy, that would then of course become a kind of investment spurt that would replace external demand. They thought that by doing this they would be buying time. They knew that they had about 5 or 6 years of this, and they were hoping that within those 5 or 6 years America and Europe would get their act together and push up the level of aggregate demand globally, so as to be able to prevent the bubbles in China from bursting. Neither America, and certainly nor Europe, came to the party. And the Chinese bubble started deflating. The Chinese authorities have been very skilled at preventing that deflation from becoming a complete blow-up. But they can't stop. They are not King Canute, they're not even trying to order the tide to return. And in that 2013 edition of the Global Monitor, I was finishing off the book saying that this is a great question, the one you put to me. Germany redirected its net exports from the periphery of Europe after 2010 to China. To China, not to the other emerging economies, to China. Or to economies that were kept afloat by China. So effectively to China. And I was saying that this is not going to last because the Chinese bubble, which was a bubble intentionally, it wouldn't be anything else, was going to deflate. Slowly, fast, medium fast, it doesn't matter how it would happen. And now this is already happening. And in addition to this, you have the rest of the emerging economies and China together, which now, as we speak, are characterized, typified by a level of private sector indebtedness which is higher than that America and Europe had prior to the 2008 collapse. That speaks volumes for what's coming. Even if you don't have Lehman Brothers-like catastrophes in China, this level of private sector debt is such that it leads to a simple conclusion. We're not going to have investment-led growth anymore. Not in the emerging markets. Since we're certainly not having investment-led growth in Europe and the United States, we are simply not going to be able to envisage a situation where Germany will continue along the lines of beggar thy neighbor to maintain its net export-driven growth and to ignore the rest of the Eurozone. Does this mean that some sense is going to be knocked into the heads of the people in the German Ministry of Finance? Or does it mean that denial is going to be maintained through greater doses of authoritarianism in the European Union? It could be either. In the former case, if some sense prevails and therefore there is greater openness to the idea of creating the circumstances for a new deal for Europe by means of, instance, energizing the European Investment Bank to create an investment-led growth drive, then there is hope. But I very much fear that denial will be the order of the day, like it has been over the last 5-6 years, in which case Germany will become more deflationary and the rest of Europe is going to descend deeper into depression. If you take into consideration everything we said before about the refugees, about foreign policy, about the geopolitical issues confronting us, and you add to this mix the developments on the deflation-depression front that are aided and abetted by what's going on in China, the picture that you are ending up with becomes bleaker and bleaker.